I'm David Remnick of The New Yorker magazine, sitting in tonight for Charlie Rose. Poet, playwright, and activist Wole Soyinka is here. He was the first African to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. In his fight for African justice and democracy, he has been repeatedly exiled from his homeland, Nigeria, as well as sentenced to death. He received great acclaim for his childhood autobiography, Ake, The Years of Childhood. His new book tells the story of his struggles and triumphs as an adult. It is called You Must Set Forth at Dawn. I'm pleased to welcome Wole Soyinka to this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
You said you would never write the memoir of your adulthood. Your first volume of memoirs is extremely famous throughout the world, and I wonder why you decided to get around to it.
Well, I shouldn't have spoken so soon. I meant it when I said it. I felt that the years of childhood, the years of innocence, really are the ones which one can absolutely vouch for as being completely authentic. And by that I mean not that one deliberately lies in, after childhood, but one elides certain things. You don't tell the total truth. You cannot. It's not possible.
And just for our viewers, if you'd set that scene of your childhood, which was obviously in Nigeria, what kind of family did you come from? Income level, education, and all the rest?
My father was a school teacher, a headmaster in primary school, and my mother was a kind of petty trader and also an activist in her own right. I came from a Christian background, but I soon lapsed in terms of that religion.
Was your school a Christian school?
It was a missionary school, Christian missionary school, and afterwards I went to government college, which was more or less a secular school. Yes.
And you said somewhere that your family was a family of word spinners in the culture. What does that mean? Is that word spinners in the Yoruba sense in Nigeria?
In the Yoruba sense. I come from a culture, not just mine alone. In Nigeria, you have the Igbo also, which would speak a lot in metaphors, use proverbs quite a lot, and the very music of language is one which fascinates and is exploited by writers, oral historians, poets, etc., etc.
And so you're growing up hearing fairy tales or folklore from your parents or from in school. How does it work?
I grew up, hearing folk tales and also history, vignettes from history, learning about the heroes of society, the historical figures. It was an environment of legends as well as myth.
And how does that coexist with the colonial environment that Nigeria was in at that time?
Oh, there was no contradiction at all. Very often the myths just took on new clothes, sort of Christian clothes, and in some parts of the same society, Islamic clothing. But basically, the archetypes, I think we find are pretty much the same in all cultures.
And in school proper, were you learning English literature or African literature or both? Or how did that kind of colonial bifurcated mindset or education work when you were a young man?
First of all, we grew up being taught in Yoruba, and being taught in Yoruba meant that you read Yoruba history, you read Yoruba writers. I grew up, in fact, later on to translate one of the great classics of Yoruba literature into English to make it accessible. It's Obujo Ninu Igbo Erumale, which I translated as The Forest of a Thousand Demons. And so it was a pretty kind of ecumenical kind of teaching. We learned, of course, history from the colonial point of view, but
for example, history from the colonial point of view, what kind of conflict were you in terms of your education?
Let's begin with, we learned about Yoruba history, for instance, the heroes and the historic figures in Yoruba history. But of course, when you went to the higher level, the senior section of the primary school, then you learned about the great heroisms of British adventurers. The British never lost any war, of course. They always defeated the quote-unquote natives and also their competitors in the colonial stakes, the French, for instance, or the Germans. The British always came out on top. That's what I meant by learning history from a colonial point of view.
What was the feeling of anticipation as times came close to 1960 and the release from the colonial yoke? What was expected among your generation in Nigeria and other African countries? What did you think was ahead?
Yes, not so much what was expected of us, but what we were certain we were going to deliver. As I said in another of my books, I said we were in no doubt at all that we were the Renaissance people. We were about to take our destiny in our own hands, to show off the genius of the black race, to show the British and the Europeans a thing or two about the natural genius of the African peoples. The expectations which we had and the demands we made on ourselves were very, very high. And so that led to quite a bit of impatience.
What were these expectations? What were you reading at the time, and what was the feel of your generation? How old were you when independence came?
Independence, I just left, I was then about 26, but we began, what we call the partial independence began some years before, in 1956 to be precise. The independence for the entire nation was 1960, but we already had what you might call regional self-government. And talking about what we read history. By that time, of course, we traveled, many of us had traveled out, so we were able to see history from a far more global viewpoint.
You had been out of the country, had you not by then? You'd been in England and elsewhere?
Yes, I studied in England, in Leeds, from 54 to 58, took my degree in 57, then dropped out in 58 to study theatre.
How did that shape your politics, being outside of the country for a few years?
Being outside the country, being in England, paradoxically made me far more fiercely nationalist, more anti-colonial. I'd begun to imbibe something of leftist ideology. Was able to see that the system, the ideological system of our colonial masters were not necessarily compatible with the expectations and the development strategies of a developing country.
Mm-hmm. Who were your heroes at the time of when colonialism was in its death throes? Who were the political and literary heroes that you were looking up to in the late 50s, coming into 1960?
I don't think it was so much as looking at heroes as looking at systems, structures. For instance, I was greatly fascinated by the Spanish Civil War. There nearly was a revolution in Spain, and unfortunately the triumph of fascism. I was interested in the communist revolution. I didn't ever become a communist, understand, but I was interested in the...
What was the temptation of ideology then? If you say you almost became a communist, there must have been some kind of temptation in a certain time and place.
Yes, I never really did become a communist because I could not accept the doctrinaire, the rigidity of the ideology and the kind of state control over every facet of life. But I was interested in Marxism and socialism as a humanistic ideology, one which made for an egalitarian condition among human beings, gave basically, ideally, equal opportunities to every individual, whether you were high-born or low-born. That kind of leveling of society fascinated me enormously in terms of my own ideological development. And of course, don't forget that we also had we're undergoing the experience of settler colonialism in many parts of Africa. Mm-hmm. Kenya, in particular, the Rhodesias, very different from the sort of indirect rule which we underwent in West Africa. But most of all, I was exercised by the hideous injustice, the insult that was apartheid South Africa. I think that really was what honed the political tendencies of many of us at that age.
And you traveled there?
No, I hadn't at the time, but South Africa for us was the goal. That was the destination. We were going to go down there and liberate South Africa. That was the dream.
How was that going to be done?
Oh,
from afar, for a young Nigerian man.
Now you understand why I was fascinated by the Spanish Civil War,
so
the role of the artists.
In the role of young leftist artists going to Spain, Hemingway and Dos Passos.
That's right. That was the role we saw for ourselves. Yes.
In terms of African writers, who were models there for you in the, I guess, late 50s we're talking about?
Well, remember that contemporary African literature, as we know it today, really didn't commence before, let us say, writers like Chinua Achebe. There's a lot of literature in the traditional languages, of course.
Achebe was the author of Things Fall Apart.
Things Fall Apart,
right.
that's right.
Who's now at Bard College, right?
Bard College, yes.
Here.
And then you had the very idiosyncratic style of Amos Tutuola, author of The Palm Wine Drinkard and so on, which fascinated me. It is he had his own unique syntax, and he came to the attention of writers like Dylan Thomas. It was through Dylan Thomas that became known in the European world. But it would be wrong to say that either was a model in any sense.
So the great bulk of writers available to you were probably European writers or English
European
language writers.
That's what I studied. And I had, depending on mood, I had favorites. Sean O'Casey was one of my favorite playwrights. Of course, who doesn't love Shakespeare? I haven't met one individual who just isn't sucked in completely by Shakespeare.
When did you, as it were, put yourself over the wall politically? When did you immerse yourself in politics to such a degree that it became self-endangering? Because it certainly, you spent two years behind bars under the reign of Sani Abacha, and you've been arrested, I think, maybe 10 times, no less than that. When did you decide to make your commitment total and dangerous?
With small correction, it was under Gowon that I spent time in prison. Abacha just wanted to kill me, that's all. And I managed to escape his clutches, yes, and then put me on trial on treason charges. You see, we had this romantic dream of going to liberate South Africa and leaving Nigeria to the politicians. We felt they could handle it. They were the first-line nationalists. You know, the slogans were beautiful, the declarations, anti-colonial slogans. Pan-Africanism was, the buzzword. And so we felt we were free to move south. And then we began to observe these politicians whom we were going to leave behind to mind the house. And at some point or the other, we realized that, look, charity begins at home. We'd better cover our rear before we start romancing our way down to southern Africa. And that's how I became engaged in the politics of Nigeria, because it was clear that these politicians were not to be trusted. Many of them, just few exceptions, but many of them saw themselves as inheritors of the colonial mantle. They were stepping into the shoes of the colonial masters with all the privileges, the indifference to the population. In other words, they brought with them a whole baggage of alienation. And this is what we began to contest.
You were a ferocious protester and activist against Sani Abacha, who reigned from 93 to 99, or 98 when he died rather mysteriously. And was it your feeling at the time that he was unique in Nigerian history? Do you think it's possible for that kind of level of cruelty and oppression to return in Nigeria? You have a very ambivalent, I would say, relation to the current president, Obasanjo, who at certain times you've counted as a friend, and he's, when your work has been celebrated, he's come around and said nice things about you, but at the same time you've been rather tough on him. How are we to understand where Nigeria is now after so many years of really vicious cruelty at the top?
Yeah, well, we've had cruel leaders before, whether civilian or military, but never experienced anything like Sani Abacha, and hope we never will again. He was a psychopath. His record in the military indicated very clearly that, in fact, he should have been thrown out of the army. And ironically, the person who stopped him being thrown out was this very Obasanjo, whom he then jailed and sentenced to death, in turn. So that's Sani Abacha for you. He had real problems, and he loved power.
You think he was clinically psychotic?
I think he was clinically psychotic. Yeah. There's no question at all about that. He loved power, and he was greedy.
Now, how to understand the current leader? A couple of weeks ago, Bill Clinton met with Obasanjo, and they expressed themselves as great friends, and he was here to see the president, George Bush, and everything seemed to go very smoothly. When you see that, do you think that's too unambiguous an endorsement of what's going on in Nigeria now?
Well, we've been studying very closely the U.S. Position vis-a-vis Obasanjo. Obasanjo, quite frankly, has been a big disappointment to many of us.
You had hoped what, and what did you get?
Well, we'd hoped, look at an individual who had been a military dictator before, and not a vicious one, not a vicious one. And then
he kept to his promise. He came to power by a military coup and then said he would wait for an election, and he was good to his word.
That's right. And he handed over power to civilians, and he earned the, justly the accolade of the entire world and of the nation. So it was an example to Africa. After Senghor, who also, knew when to quit the stage. And then he continued to be outspoken, critical, in a very constructive way of his successors. And then Sani Abacha decided to deal with him, roped him in, coup attempt, sentenced him to death. And the feeling when he came out and he was sort of, manipulated, he was elected, let's say he was elected into the presidency, anyway, was that somebody who had tasted both sides of life and who had the experience of running a nation could not really be all that bad. We would rather it had been pure civilian, so we shed once and for all this garb of military control. However, we hoped he would, and he didn't do too badly considering the baggage, the negative baggage he inherited after several decades of military despotism and looting. However, he's become power drunk. His two terms in office should end in April next year.
Now, you are here. You spend some of your time in Las Vegas, of all places, and where you have an academic post. Some of your time in Nigeria, elsewhere in
I've taught
Southern
in
California,
Emory,
in Boston, all over the place.
Right now I'm teaching in Howard. I've actually left Nevada, and so on. I've always had stints of teaching all over the world, in France, in England, in the United States, of course. And when I then went into my last bout of exile, the one good thing about the United States, which will say for it, it's very largeness. Somebody can disappear into the United States. You can create an anonymous existence, and you can follow your own project, as long as you're, of course, not attacking the United States. So the United States was a very good base for me to create a base for fighting Sani Abacha, for organizing, mobilizing Nigerians all over the world for the fight, the struggle.
Now, what about U.S. policy? I'd love to know what you're feeling about what the United States is doing or not doing where Darfur is concerned.
Well, that's the irony. That's the United States, I suppose, for such a large country, is full of contradictions. It gets it right in certain aspects, and then it makes colossal blunders, as in Iraq, for instance. Then it goes comatose over a situation like Darfur. The violation of humanity there. A new Rwanda is taking place in the Sudan right now. And the African Union, the UNO, the United States, all the powers which are in a position, have a responsibility to intervene. They sit on their hands.
In particular, what can the United States do in Darfur, and what is it not doing? It's a situation made very complicated by things like the African Union and all the rest. What can the United States do? What's its abdication?
To push I don't like unilateral action. It's one of the reasons I disapprove of the action of the United States in Iraq. I don't want the United States to intervene unilaterally. But the United States has a powerful voice and is a powerful force in the United Nations. The United States can unilaterally, for instance, assist the AU peacekeeping forces in the Sudan, give it logistical support, transportation for troops, even funds, to enable impoverished African states to restore the people of Darfur to their proper humanity. So it is that kind of action which I expect from the United States.
What do you suppose is the reason for its hesitance and reticence to act in Darfur? Iraq?
Because of Iraq. It's a colossal blunder in Iraq. So the United States now, where the African states, the world would applaud its action, it's already burnt its fingers in totally uncalled for intervention in Iraq.
We are constantly deluged with, for those who care to read about it or see, with all the various public health failures in Africa, the horrible epidemic of AIDS and other diseases. Where can you point in Africa to a success story that's a kind of model of what both U.S. policy toward Africa should be and what internal policy in Africa is not an ideal state, but in a politics that's actually working?
I can only point to what you might call indirect assistance. I cannot point to any nation on the African continent where the U.S. policy has been directly responsible for positive and both qualitative and quantitative changes. In other words, I can point to, assistances here and there, some very well-principled ambassador who's persuaded his or her government to assist Africa in this or that direction. I know a lot of help is being given now by the United States to the fight against AIDS. That must be commended. But in terms of political decisions, policies or politics, I really cannot point to a place where you can say the U.S. policy has assisted in positive development in
Do you
Africa.
anticipate deepening fundamentalisms in places like Nigeria and elsewhere?
Oh, it's already there. It's already there, and it's something which has to be contested very strongly.
How?
Well, it depends very much, of course, on the nations themselves. The impunity with which some of these fundamentalists commit their outrage, the confidence which they have in getting away literally with murder, with mayhem, like the kind of reaction to the Danish cartoonists. See what happened in Nigeria. Fundamentalists fell on innocent worshippers, went on the rampage, slit people's throats. The action of the Nigerian government was very, very weak in that respect. So it's up to the nations to terminate once and for all this culture of impunity with which the fundamentalists act.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time. Wole Soyinka, who is the author of the new memoir, You Must Set Forth at Dawn. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very
so
much.
much.
It's been a delight talking to you.